Hello and welcome to 80 Years of Aerospace at Lostock. My name's David Kaye and I'm a long-time rank and file member of Horwich Heritage Society. It's almost 60 years ago now that I commenced a mechanical engineering apprenticeship at the de Havilland factory in Lostock, and that training and that qualification was to stand me in very good stead for an engineering career in another sector. However, I still maintained an interest in the Lostock scene, largely through the cricket club and the cricket section, with which I've been involved now for no less than 56 years. Some years ago, I found myself researching the de Havilland story, and I embarked upon parts of what we might call the de Havilland Trail. One thing led to another, and I began to build up interest and knowledge in de Havilland's 4 successor companies. Now we find ourselves at the point where the story has spanned 8 decades at Lostock, and the purpose of this presentation is to share a few aspects of that story with you.
Thank you, David. Although Horwich is best known for its remarkable railway heritage, this is the story of another local engineering giant, which began life little more than a mile away, some half a century after the opening of the renowned locomotive works, and which was also destined to write a key chapter in Bolton's remarkable industrial history. 2018 marks the 80th anniversary of the official opening of a factory which heralded the arrival of aeronautical engineering in Bolton, which, as with railway engineering, was to prove a vital element of the local economic and social scene for many decades. Today, with that factory long gone, and the area now best known as the home of Bolton Wanderers and the Middlebrook complex, it is left to the name of a bustling thoroughfare to provide us with a regular reminder of a very special story, that of de Havilland and its 4 successor companies. This map highlights just how close the 2 huge engineering complexes were to each other, and whilst the de Havilland factory lay just across the Horwich-Bolton boundary in Lostock, like the loco works, it was to provide secure and fulfilling employment for generations of Horwich men and women. What a contrast there is with this map, published in the 1970s, shortly after the building of the M61 motorway and the Horwich link to Junction 6. The de Havilland factory is on the east side of Lostock Lane, then largely surrounded by fields. And although it may be a bizarre thought, without this man, the story of this huge manufacturing complex may not have unfolded. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, and almost from the outset his intentions became frighteningly clear, causing great disquiet throughout Europe. By 1936, the British government became convinced that war was inevitable, so they formulated some major contingency plans which were kept top secret. These plans included confidential talks with the leaders of the country's vital defence industries, one of whom was a truly remarkable man and who is the crux of our story today. Geoffrey de Havilland was fascinated with all things mechanical from his earliest years, and as a young man became obsessed with the subject of flight, reading everything he could find about the earliest days of aviation. But the first aeroplane he was ever to set eyes upon was the one he was to design and build himself in 1909, aged just 27, and funded by an early legacy of £1,000 from his grandfather. De Havilland was to work minor miracles with that money, employing his long-time partner Frank Hurl, who helped him build his first aeroplane from bits of wood, piano wire, bicycle wheels, and wings covered in cellulose stiffened cotton sheets, stitched together by his wife on her Singer sewing machine. This fragile construction was assembled in the upper floor of a Fulham workshop and had to be dismantled to get it downstairs. Still in bits, the rudimentary plane was loaded onto a rented lorry and driven deep into the Hampshire countryside to a prestigious estate where de Havilland had bought a basic wooden hangar from a man named Brabazon, the first Briton to hold a pilot's licence. After reassembly, de Havilland took to the cockpit and attempted his first ever takeoff, but it ended in disaster, fortunately with only minor injuries to Geoffrey but major damage to the plane, which needed a complete rebuild. Undaunted, de Havilland and Hurl worked tirelessly for a further year, until the 10th of September 1910 proved an iconic date in British aviation history, when the first of many thousands of de Havilland airplanes took off successfully. This famous image, painted by renowned artist Terence Cuneo, shows de Havilland in the cockpit and Hurl lying on the ground, eventually signalling to the pilot that the wheels had left the ground. That makeshift grassed airstrip, known locally as Seven Barrows, was part of the Highclere estate, the seat of Lord Carnarvon, better known to us today as Downton Abbey. These happenings in Hampshire over a century ago were to prove the genesis of an astonishing story, ultimately leading to Geoffrey de Havilland creating one of the world's great aeronautical empires, which, as a result of a complex political, economic and strategic jigsaw, was to evolve into 4 subsequent companies, all to become household names locally, nationally and internationally. De Havilland, Hawker Siddeley, BA, Matra BA and ultimately MBDA for current missile systems.
Whilst the roots of the de Havilland story lie in the grounds of a stately home in Hampshire, we need to have an understanding of the Bolton connection. After the events of 1910, Geoffrey de Havilland found himself flat broke and he needed a job. Somehow he managed to sell his aeroplane to the government for £400, but more importantly, he was given a job as designer and test pilot at the Royal Army Balloon Factory in Farnborough, later to become known as the Royal Aircraft Establishment. He hadn't been there very long when his talent for all things aeronautical shone through, and he was destined to play a crucial role in the country's defence of the realm during the Great War. Between 1914 and 1918, Geoffrey de Havilland designed no less than 12 different aeroplanes and supervised the manufacture of over 9,000. He worked dangerously long hours throughout those years, and it was no surprise when, at the end of the war, he had a nervous breakdown and collapsed. His personal plight was increased when the government told him they were taking away his job at Farnborough, as they believed there was no future for aircraft in peacetime. However, Sir Geoffrey and a handful of colleagues thought otherwise. In 1920, Geoffrey and 4 colleagues formed the de Havilland Aircraft Company Limited, and they were to achieve almost immediate success. In little more than 15 years, de Havilland was a name known and respected throughout the world of aviation worldwide, and it was no surprise when Geoffrey de Havilland was amongst those people called to Whitehall for confidential talks with the government. There was, however, a concern, because all the de Havilland factories were located in the Greater London area and hence considered vulnerable to German bombers. The government had a plan for de Havilland to build a series of so-called shadow factories in safer parts of the country. These would be funded by the government but operated by de Havilland personnel. Unemployment at the time was extremely high in Bolton, and when Bolton Council heard about this plan, they put in a very strong bid for the Propeller factory. Coming into focus at that time was what was called a large dome-shaped farmer's field near Lostock. And this was government shortlisted, but they wanted Sir Geoffrey de Havilland to have the determining say with regard to the location. So it was that in August 1936, together with his trusted First Lieutenant Frank Hurl, he piloted his own de Havilland Moth aircraft from the Hatfield Aerodrome and flew to that field in Lostock. He gave it a once over, gave it the thumbs up, and the die was cast. De Havilland propellers were to be made in Bolton. I found the de Havilland story really fascinating and remarkable. He was one of the greatest Britons ever, and if you'd like to know more about this man who had such an impact on our local industrial scene, I strongly recommend his autobiography, Sky Fever.
20 years on, a Bolton Evening News article expanded on the story, recalling that the Lostock welcoming party was headed by Alderman James Parkes, chairman of Bolton Industrial Development Committee, who held a strip of wallpaper in the breeze as an improvised airsock to guide the de Havilland Moth safely down at the end of that historic flight. But in addition to the attractive inducements of Bolton Corporation, another factor played a part in the choice of Lostock. That very same farmer's field was well known to another of Britain's intrepid aviators, Alan Cobham, a contemporary and friend of Geoffrey de Havilland, who had been chief test pilot for the de Havilland Company in the 1920s, before embarking on his own mission to promote the cause of aviation. Cobham believed every town and city in Britain should have its own airfield, and to further this end he formed his legendary Flying Circus, which toured the country with aircraft of many types during the early 1930s. Lostock became one of over 150 sites nationwide to witness amazing aerobatic displays, and allowed countless people to get close up to aeroplanes for the first time. It is safe to conclude that de Havilland was influenced, at least in part, to make that 1936 fact-finding flight on the recommendation of an old friend already familiar with the location. A legacy of those Cobham displays is a valued collection of aerial photographs, which provide a remarkable insight into the landscape of the area 80 years ago. This 1922 watercolour shows the rustic hamlet of Washpool Cottages, which once stood where we now see the forest of traffic lights along de Havilland Way at the approach to Middlebrook. To the extreme right we can see part of that large dome-shaped farmer's field. This second photograph from the Cobham era provides a perfect panorama of the field, which was to become the northern home of de Havilland. The aircraft are like tinky toys parked alongside the various trade and information tents. The temporary airfield was hidden from public view by a high canvas screen to encourage admission to the site at a cost of 6p a head. For those who could afford it in the extreme austerity of the 1930s and also willing to risk it, short pleasure flights could be had for £0.50. Following the decision in favour of Lostock, plans rapidly moved ahead. Whilst design of the factory was still underway and tenders being sought for the building, a former cotton mill in Garside Street was rented for £7 a week and used as a training centre for the first de Havilland recruits, most of whom had been made redundant in the declining cotton industry. The successful tenderer for the new factory was local builder William Townsend Limited, and construction began in March 1937. With the increasing likelihood of war, the project was fast-tracked to a breathtaking degree, with production commencing in August, even before the brick shell of the building had any windows. The first completed propeller sets rolled off the production line before Christmas 1937, but the official opening of the factory was a low priority, perhaps even an afterthought, as the ceremonials didn't take place until the 15th of July 1938. This picture shows the northwest corner of the building complex and the main entrance for office personnel. Although now demolished, the 1937 date stone was salvaged and preserved for posterity, as we shall see. As the company grew rapidly, workers were drawn from all parts of Bolton and many surrounding towns, with most travelling via public transport, although clearly a few fortunate owned private cars. Legend has it that it was the conductor of one of these buses who first called out the destination as "to Havilland," and to use a little jargon unknown at the time, this was to go viral. Whilst taken several decades after construction, this photograph shows the impressive facade of the central office block and the main entrance, although this was strictly out of bounds to all except senior executives. Taken around 20 years after the days of Cobham's flying circus, this aerial photograph shows the extent and location of the 1937 factory, as well as the so-called South Side, billed as a northern base for the Havilland's engine division, which had a short-lived and somewhat ill-fated life alongside its propeller division cousin in the early 1950s.
Those 1940 losses over France caused great disquiet in both government and RAF circles, and it was agreed that all our squadrons of fighters, the Hurricanes and the Spitfires, must be equipped with variable pitch propeller systems without delay before the skirmishes over the skies reached the southern counties of Britain. So it was that Lostock was to encounter its finest hour. The lads and lasses of de Havilland there worked 24/7 for many weeks, churning out thousands of propeller sets, many of which were fitted in situ to the aircraft on the airfields in the southeast, including places like the famous Biggin Hill. As a result, the Battle of Britain was won, the war was won, and I'm speaking to you now in a Bolton accent rather than a Berlin accent, as might well have been the case.
Following this welcome post-war reprieve and the arrival of the engine division, confidence at Lostock was high during the early 1950s, epitomised by the flags flying proudly to mark the Queen's coronation. Given the company's complex sphere of operations, profiling the decades of state-of-the-art manufacturing activities is a challenging task, but we'll start by taking a look at the original prime product, propellers. Since time immemorial, man has dreamt of emulating birds and taking to the skies, as these ancient sketches show, and when humans finally elevated themselves above the terra firma for the first time in the 18th century balloons, hand-crank propellers provided the forward motion. But it was not until the beginning of the 20th century that the world first witnessed powered flight, when Wilbur and Orville Wright took off from Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in December 1903, with their craft powered by a single wooden propeller similar to these featured here. Throughout the first 20 years of powered flight, all propellers were of solid or so-called fixed pitch construction, meaning that the angle of the propeller blades couldn't be adjusted. This was a limiting factor with regard to the control of aeroplanes, similar in some ways to driving a car without any gears. It was soon realised that performance could be greatly enhanced with the introduction of variable pitch propeller mechanisms, which act as aerial gearboxes. Whilst de Havilland produced several versions of the variable pitch propeller in the 20s and early 30s, all of these had shortcomings. So the company scoured the world to seek the best available technology. In 1934, this led to the signing of a licensing agreement with Hamilton Standard Corporation of Hartford, Connecticut, who had patented the innovative hydrostatic variable pitch system, a complex and expensive design requiring 800 precision components. This partnership was to prove an enduring one, seminal in the history of de Havilland and of huge significance to the shadow factory to be built at Lostock 3 years down the line. This new transatlantic link led to the initial use of the American term air screw, but the British Air Ministry soon ruled this should be changed to propeller. For almost 60 years, Lostock would manufacture countless thousands of propeller sets for over 200 aircraft of all shapes and sizes, and sold to governments and airlines in over 70 countries worldwide. And here we see some of those propellers in the final stages of assembly. To use a little RAF speak, these are the unfortunate results of pranging the kite, with the aftermath of many hair-raising landings resulting in lucrative business for Lostock. The propeller repair department grew constantly, eventually leading to the purchase of Lakefield Mill in Wartime, which became the company's specialised unit for the repair of damaged blades. Terence Cuneo, well known for his paintings of steam trains, was regularly commissioned by de Havilland to provide images for the company's magazine Enterprise. This one shows a top brass delegation visiting the blade grinding department at Lostock. Following the Battle of Britain in summer 1940, Winston Churchill delivered one of his most famous speeches, beginning with those immortal words, "Never in the field of human conflict." He could, maybe should, have also paid tribute to the lads and lasses of de Havilland, Lostock, since the magnitude of the Lostock contribution to the victorious war effort cannot be overemphasised. Prior to the war and during its early phases, de Havilland were manufacturing variable pitch propellers only for RAF bombers, as it was thought that the fighters, including Hurricanes and Spitfires, with their fixed pitch or two-pitch propellers, were capable of matching the manoeuvrability of Luftwaffe's planes. But in a prelude to the Battle of Britain, when British and German fighters clashed in ferocious aerial combat over France in early 1940, there was a nasty shock in store. The Messerschmitts proved much superior, due largely to their variable pitch propellers, and for every German aircraft lost, the RAF lost 4. Hitler's aim of invading Britain was never in doubt, and this German aerial reconnaissance photograph of Lostock is evidence of that. With the factory planned in the sure knowledge of a forthcoming conflict, its protection was paramount. A battery of 4.5-inch anti-aircraft guns was situated to the west of Alexandra Road, and so-called smudge pots were located along Chorley Road. When ignited, these gave off dense black smoke, blanketing the entire factory in the prevailing northwesterly winds. Pillboxes at the corners of the factory housed quick-firing anti-tank guns, whilst the gatehouse had twin Lewis machine guns mounted on the roof.
The Lostock factory was built basically as an expedient in anticipation of war, and it was widely thought that at the end of the war the factory would be closed and that would be that. However, both the government and the main board of de Havilland at head office in Hatfield had been so impressed with the Lostock workforce that ways were examined of keeping the factory open with additional work. Furthermore, it was thought that propellers were destined to be phased out with the advent of the jet engine, but an unexpected bonus was the arrival of turbojet aircraft, which perpetuated propeller manufacture at Lostock far beyond what could have been anticipated. But it was a development just a few years after the end of the war which was to have a major impact on the continuing Lostock story. That development came in the form of an invitation letter. It was an open letter sent to all British companies supplying defence equipment and systems, and it was penned in 1948 by Sir George Gardner, the Principal Director of the Ministry of Defence. His aim was to provide each of the three armed services with weapons to combat current and future threats. His concluding paragraph is quite remarkable. It reads, "Will you, in the interests of the nation's defence, detach some of your finest people to work on something which is a doubtful starter, politically vulnerable, and perhaps even unprofitable?" That's quite a sales pitch, isn't it?
That historic post-war letter was to prove of massive significance for Lostock, heralding the start of a new and exciting chapter, with the commencement of production of the second major product group in our story, the projectiles. De Havilland's Propeller division responded enthusiastically to the invitation, soon resulting in the evolution of one of Britain's first ever guided missiles. As with propellers, whilst designed at Hatfield, Lostock was to be the manufacturing centre. The prototype missile was initially codenamed Blue Jay, soon rechristened with a name that was to become very familiar. Firestreak was an air-to-air weapon incorporating an innovative infrared homing device and was to prove the first of a long list of missile types manufactured at Lostock in subsequent years. Its development was given massive momentum by the Korean War of the early 1950s, although the RAF wasn't able to bring it into service until 1957. Lostock's second life was to embrace decades of missile manufacture of ever-increasing sophistication and of all possible launch and target combinations, spanning air, sea and land. And this critically important phase in the factory's history was outlined in this compelling story of the first 50 years of British guided weapons manufacture. The ever-increasing portfolio of missiles led to Lostock manufacturing for all three armed services: the Army, the Navy and the RAF, as well as fulfilling contracts awarded by a host of friendly regimes, earning many millions of pounds for the British economy. Missiles manufactured at Lostock were either used or held in state of readiness for many of the world's major conflicts, including those in Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, the Falklands, Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya. Whilst missile production was initially concentrated in Lostock's high-security West Block, the booming business soon necessitated the building of a satellite factory at Farnworth, dedicated exclusively to missile manufacture. Whilst perhaps not quite paralleling the popularity of those issued by Panini, many workers were well known to have their own surreptitious sticker collections. And this graphic gives some indication of just what was to follow in the wake of trailblazing Firestreak. Lostock and Farnworth were to host a constant procession of military and Ministry of Defence top brass, while Christmas 1983 proved something of a red letter day at Lostock, as delivery of the 1000th Skyflash missile for the RAF was celebrated in some style.
The story of the Lostock factory in the post-war years was to have many chapters as a result of rationalisation in the aircraft industry, nationalisation and political and economic factors. For many years, however, the future of the factory remained uncertain, hanging by a thread. And there was a key reason for this. the vast majority of the work came in the form of government defence contracts, and it could be said that for several decades a great barometer of the state of world peace or otherwise came in the levels of business going through the shop floor at Lostock. For a number of years the management investigated ways of bringing some stability, a regular flow of business irrespective of the vagaries and the ups and downs of defence jobs. The answer ultimately was to lie in product diversification.
This panel from a major article outlining the Lostock success story featured in the Bolton Evening News in 1995. It graphically illustrates the amazing diversity of products manufactured over the decades. In addition to the panoply of propellers and projectiles, the list also includes all manner of aircraft-related ancillary equipment, such as jet engine components, undercarriages and air conditioning systems. Away from aviation, Lostock manufactured components for tanks and artillery, whilst non-defence work involved systems for British Rail, engines for Lotus cars, machinery for the manufacture of cigarettes and shoes, and even medical products such as artificial joints and pacemakers. It's a list long enough to set any pulse racing. The versatility of the factory's manufacturing capabilities was down to what many regarded as Lostock's jewel in the crown, its machine shop. It grew ever larger over the decades, always incorporating world-leading technology in its serried ranks of machinery, with some knowledgeable observers claiming it to be the largest machine shop in Europe, at its peak housing over 1,500 machine tools of every imaginable type. Throughout its history, a major factory in the company's success has been the pantheon of outstanding engineers, and in highlighting the role of the machine shop, we must mention the man who was the driving force behind much of its development, Bill Neal, a colourful and at times controversial Scotsman who believed passionately in the capabilities of the Lostock workforce, and was the man largely responsible for the programme of product diversification. He often needed to overcome strong resistance to his plans from various powerful parties, but he usually won the day. During a lifetime in engineering, Bill Neal spent 2 lengthy periods in charge at Lostock in the 1950s and the 1970s, and in retirement he wrote 2 volumes of autobiography which make compelling reading with much about his time at Lostock. Of the numerous aeroplanes designed and manufactured by de Havilland, the Comet was perhaps the best known. Coming into service in the early 1950s, it was the world's first commercial jet airliner, but its story was one both of triumph and tragedy. When several comets fell from the skies in quick succession, all production was halted until the cause was established. The aviation industry learned quickly about the complexities of fuselage metal fatigue, and when production of a redesigned Comet resumed, Lostock played its part in the eventual success story, manufacturing many components, including the huge undercarriages. Given the fact that Lostock never had its own airstrip, we're not sure what was going on here. Perhaps someone looked out of the wrong navigation charts, or maybe the photograph was taken on the 1st of April. Given the turbulent times of the 1980s and 1990s and the shrinking workforce, it came as no great surprise when the main factory complex closed in 1997, with all remaining missile-related activities transferred to the south side. Reality certainly hit home when the 35-acre site was put up for sale, and the old end-of-an-era cliché was scarcely adequate. The dramatic news prompted a widespread outbreak of that most precious of human emotions, nostalgia. And 20 years on, there's still an abundance of it around. innumerable lives and livelihoods had been impacted by the company, and during the peak years of the northern group of companies, Lostock, Farnworth and Lakefield, together with several satellite units, collectively employing over 7,500 people, comparable with the population of many small British towns such as Longridge, Pembroke and Dawlish. And in many respects, Lostock had its own small town infrastructure comprising police, fire service, medical team and school. An apprentice training facility opened at Lostock in 1946 as a branch of the internationally renowned de Havilland Aeronautical Technical Training School, first established in 1928 by Geoffrey de Havilland himself, at the then company headquarters in Edgware. The northern branch proved such a major factor in Lostock's success, producing a constant stream of first-class engineers and designers. Here is the 1959 intake comprising 130 boys and 1 girl, and your compiler, David Kaye, is in there somewhere, complete with national health specs. And his indentures show he initially earned the princely sum of £2, 15 shillings and 8 pence per week. Riches indeed. The first apprentice training school had originally been one of the company's air raid shelters during the war, and although dungeon-like, it served its purpose well for many years, until continued investment in training brought a welcome modern facility in 1982. Lostock also had its own library, a parks and gardens department, and a succession of regularly published in-house newspapers. For many, past companionships on the shop floor or in the office bring back cherished memories, while others recall their Lostock leisure time with great affection. From the outset, the company recognised the many benefits to be derived from sponsoring sports and social activities, and no sooner had those pioneering people been recruited for the Gartside Street operation than a vibrant social scene began to develop. The embryonic organisation charged a penny a week for darts and domino sessions in the Gypsies' Tent pub across the road, and in no time at all a thriving sports and social club had its own identity, very soon with its own mouthpiece, the Norprop magazine. Although Lostock did not have its own dedicated sport field until 1954, ground sharing locally allowed team sports to flourish. Football and rugby during the winter, and hockey and rounders for the ladies. The huge canteen was the ideal venue for badminton and table tennis all year round, with cricket, bowls and tennis amongst the summer sports. Over the decades, there have been over 40 different sections under the umbrella of the Sports and Social Club, with cricket having provided a continuous thread since 1938. The now independent Lostock Cricket Club also celebrates its 80th anniversary in 2018 at the superb new facilities of Lostock Sports Club in Chew Moor, hopefully soon to be joined by other sports once again. For those preferring more artistic pursuits, a concert hall with fully equipped stage facilitated the production of plays and a series of very popular annual pantomimes. A greatly valued company team spirit manifested itself in gatherings of many types, such as departmental trips, retirement functions, long service presentations, and entertainment for employees' children. Other wide-ranging interests were catered for too, including a caravan club, fishing club, rifle club and wine club. And there was even a horticultural society with its own annual quest to find the Lostock man with the biggest onions. For many years, the less shy of the many ladies employees would compete for the crown of Miss Lostock, one of the highlights of the annual family weekends, which have gone down well in local folklore. With each successive annual event seeking to outdo its predecessor, thousands of people comprising employees, families and visitors would flock to the sports ground at Lostock each June to enjoy an amazing diversity of attractions and activities, with many also taking in factory tours to see firsthand where family members worked. The climaxes of many of these memorable gatherings were spectacular aerial displays, with the stars of the show including the Comet, Concorde, the Harrier jump jet and even the fabled Red Arrows. In its latter years, the event was billed as the Bolton Air Show. Particularly special was the 1987 Family Weekend, as this commemorated the 50th anniversary of the arrival of de Havilland at Lostock. Following the 1997 closure, many of these activities were inevitably consigned to history, but life at Lostock was destined to live on. By now, all activities, almost exclusively missile-related, were concentrated at the south side, and in the late 1990s, BA Dynamics merged with a cross-channel counterpart to form the Anglo-French Matra BA. Prestigious multi-million-pound defence contracts provided security for the existing employees, and more opportunities for the high-tech careers for Bolton people as the company expanded once again. Under the stewardship of Bernard Waldron, who had begun work at Lostock as a 15-year-old apprentice in 1971, Matra BA continued to consolidate, and in 2001 joined with other European partners to form the multinational MBDA, one of the world's leading manufacturers of missile systems. With the south side growing like Topsy and with all expansion opportunities exhausted, it was time to move to pastures new. In 2017, by now doubly honoured for his tremendous contributions to both the UK defence industry and the Bolton community, Dr. Bernard Waldron, MBE, MBDA's UK Director of Manufacturing, transferred his talented team into a purpose-built £50 million factory at Bolton's Logistics North Complex, where space-age facilities incorporate mind-blowing production technology. While this future-proofed facility will play a major role in helping MBDA supply its global markets for years to come, Lostock is in Bernard Waldron's blood, and whilst planning for his company's long-term future, he was clearly keen to ensure that the company's 1930s de Havilland roots will never be forgotten. And a priceless relic is displayed in the reception area, the wooden propeller from Geoffrey Havilland's Moth aeroplane. Concluding our presentation, this graphic timeline chronicles the century of aerospace achievement and encapsulates the entire Lostock story and more, from those remarkable achievements of Geoffrey de Havilland in the first decade of the 20th century onwards.
80 years of aerospace at Lostock is a somewhat long and complex story, but we hope that this presentation, coupled with the exhibition at Horwich Heritage and a look at the propellers and the projectiles, coupled with a little glimpse of the life of a remarkable man who started our story in a Hampshire field 108 years ago, will have proved at least of a little interest to you.